pack. Now, to go back to this concept of verismo we talked about a bit, we are going to invite musicologist Nigel Simeone to discuss with us the origins of verismo and how it was actually received when the operas such as Cavalleria, Rusticana and Pagliacci came out in its time. Nigel is a writer, he's a musicologist, he's a teacher, he's a broadcaster. He has written on music from the 18th to the 20th century, published books on as different composers as Janáček, Messiaen and Bernstein, and of course, here in the UK, we know him as a regular contributor to BBC Radio 3 and 4. So a warm welcome to musicologist Nigel Simeone.
So I want to try and put our operatic twins in context. And we're going to begin with this man, Giovanni Verga, who wrote the story. Now, the beginnings of verismo in Italy were not musical, but literary. And in 1880, Giovanni Verga published a collection of short stories called Vita dei Campi, Life in the Countryside, which depicted episodes featuring the working poor in Verga's native Sicily. Given the literary trends of other countries before then, it's perhaps surprising that it took so long for an Italian to tackle these subjects, but composers everywhere had fought shy of putting realism on the operatic stage. The grim realities of city life in Dickens's novels from the 1830s and 40s certainly didn't tempt composers at the time. Incidentally, Dickens was quite an opera fan and very well informed about it, and went to see Gluck's Orfeo in Paris with his great friend Arthur Sullivan. In France, Honoré de Balzac, who died in 1850, was hailed as a pioneer of realism, naturalism. And the year of Balzac's death saw Gustave Flaubert starting Madame Bovary, a novel so realistic that he was tried for obscenity and subsequently acquitted after the story appeared in 1856. The greatest French realist writer of the next generation was Émile Zola, whose L'Assommoir of 1877 is a painfully accurate description of a working-class family's descent into alcoholism and destitution. In art, of course, there was a similar move towards what Robert Herbert famously described as the painting of modern life. Among the Impressionists, Edgar Degas completed The Absinthe Drinker in 1875. Monet painted his series of Gare Saint-Lazare, Saint-Lazare Station, a couple of years later. It's in France as well that we find the one spectacular operatic precursor to the kind of realism that was to be sought by the authors and composers associated with verismo in Italy. And that's the last 10 minutes or so of Bizet's Carmen, first performed in 1875. 5 years before Verga's stories appeared. A truly innovative operatic treatment of a realist story with a setting that was rough, urban and working class. Back to Giovanni Verga. He was born in Catania in Sicily in 1840 to a prosperous family. In the 1870s he moved to Milan, but returned in the 1890s to his native Sicily, where he spent the rest of his life. He died in 1922, showered with Sicilian honours. His Life in the Country, this collection of short stories, was published in Milan in 1880. Verga's cast of characters are farm workers, shepherds, miners, villagers, publicans, innkeepers, and so on. Cavalleria Rusticana, one of the stories in this collection, is unflinching in its revelations of jealousy, violent passion, and deadly revenge, not in a mythical landscape or a medieval court, but in the Sicily of Verga's time. His other stories, incidentally, can be even more disturbing, notably one called Malaria, in which the innkeeper's 4 wives and 5 children succumb to the disease as modern life appears to pass rural Sicily by. Literally so, as Verga's story includes the newly built railway, its well-heeled passengers seeming neither to notice nor to care. Though Verga came from a prosperous family, he was genuinely interested in the characters about whom he wrote. He even photographed some of the workers on his family's estate. Verga himself turned Cavalleria Rusticana into a successful stage play, with the assistance of Giuseppe Giacosa, who was, of course, later to become one of Puccini's most successful librettists. Verga has been underrated outside Italy, his international reputation resting largely on his story that inspired Mascagni's opera. One of Verga's most energetic champions in Britain was D.H. Lawrence, who published English translations of Verga's stories in the 1920s, and who was, alas, no fan of Mascagni's. In the introduction to his translation of Cavalleria Rusticana, he wrote, "Everyone knows, of course, that Verga made a dramatized version of Cavalleria Rusticana, and that this dramatized version was the basis of the ever-popular little opera of the same name. So that Mascagni's rather feeble music has gone to immortalize a man like Verga, whose only popular claim to fame is that he wrote the aforesaid libretto. But that is fame's fault, not Verga's," says D.H. Lawrence. We can quarrel with Lawrence's assessment of the music, I certainly do, but not with his belief in Verga's writing. To a friend, actually, he described Cavalleria Rusticana, the story, as extraordinarily good, peasant, quite modern, and Homeric. In July 1888, the Milan music publisher Edoardo Sonzogno announced his second competition for a new one-act opera by a young composer. 5 years earlier, the judges of Sonzogno's first competition had managed to overlook Puccini's La Villi. And in 1888, it was Umberto Giordano's turn to be eliminated before the final stage. Not surprising, though, because more than 70 composers submitted operas to this competition. The winner was Mascagni, then in his mid-20s. Cavalleria Rusticana was duly scheduled to be performed at the Teatro Costanzi in Rome, which was then under Sonzogno's management. By a remarkable coincidence, another opera based on the same Verga story was given its premiere in the same theatre 6 weeks earlier. This was Mala Pasqua, literally Bad Easter, by Stanislao Gastaldon. First performed on the Tuesday after Easter, its title, alas, mirrored its destiny. 4 performances were quite well received by the audience, not by the critics, while the Catholic press decried it as a sacrilege and a vile insult devised for the entertainment of Freemasons and vulgar people. Makes me want to see it. What Mala Pasqua does demonstrate, though, and this is quite interesting, is that Mascagni was not alone right at the start in attempting operatic verismo. The idea was very much in the air at the time. But Cavalleria Rusticana was certainly the first to grip the public imagination, and it did so from the moment of its first performance. Italian critics had been wondering whether opera had a future with Verdi growing old, but the premiere of Cavalleria suggested that Mascagni was their man. The Costanzi Theatre on the 17th of May, 1890, was barely half full, and most of the audience was there out of a sense of duty to hear the Sonzogno competition winner, while a few had been encouraged to turn up by friends who had been to rehearsals. Gemma Bellincioni, the first Santuzza, recalled the first night. Here she is. After the Siciliana, the public applauded. After the prayer, they yelled out enthusiastically. After the duet between Santuzza and Turiddu, they exploded in delirious joy. At the end of the opera, the audience seemed literally to go crazy. They screamed, they waved their handkerchiefs, and in the corridors, strangers embraced. She really wasn't exaggerating. There were 60 curtain calls at the end, and the press reaction was ecstatic. Cavalleria was quickly taken up by houses all over Italy and soon all over the world. But this astonishing success leaves one question. What exactly makes it a verismo opera? In the case of Cav, the simple answer is that it was based on Verga's verismo story. But there are other reasons. Mascagni's use of the chorus gives us a strong sense of the opera being rooted in a community, in a village, at work, at prayer, at the pub, and of its expectations and customs, its prejudices, if you like. Throughout the single span of Cavalleria, the chorus seems to function as the conscience of the village. Mascagni attempted to introduce a musical equivalent for Verga's realism by creating a language that reflected the background of his characters. He uses popular song in a way that was quite novel in the opera house, not to introduce local colour. Mascagni at that time had never been to Sicily, so he wouldn't have known what local colour was, but to give his characters tunes that would resonate with the audience, as the soundtrack, if you like, of everyday Italian modern life. His artistry was to weld all that into a score that is clearly operatic, but cleverly pared down. Much of the word setting is syllabic. The melodic material is notable for simplicity, while the whole work coheres thanks to a series of far from simple and very clever thematic links. Its impact was felt far beyond Italy. For instance, here's one review from 1892. I quote, "Among composers, there are those who throw off their chains, shake off the dust of various theories, and enjoy their newly acquired freedom in harmonic and tonal progressions with such unconcealed delight that mere mortals are seized with vertigo. I'm talking here of Mascagni. He has flown high like a lark. Some melodies stand out with such convincing truthfulness that you feel your heart ache." The author of those words was none other than Leos Janáček. 2 years before, he started work on Jenůfer, an opera that you might well consider to be an outstanding example of Czech, specifically Moravian verismo, with its village life, its murderous plot, and so on. Leoncavallo was born in Naples in 1857, but after completing his studies, he spent a few years teaching the piano to the Egyptian aristocracy in Cairo. Then he moved to France, where he worked as a vocal coach, and a very unsuccessful young composer. He returned to Italy in 1890, and of course the first thing more or less he saw was Cavalleria rusticana. Straight away decided to have a go at his own verismo opera. Unlike Mascagni, he wrote his own libretto, but otherwise the origins of both works are quite similar, written incredibly fast, with both composers desperate for some sort of success after earlier reverses. Leoncavallo completed Pagliacci libretto and score in less than 6 months, and very cannily offered it not to Ricordi, Milan's preeminent publisher, but to Sonzogno, as another short opera to add to a catalogue that already included Cavalleria rusticana. Good move. Leoncavallo lays out his verismo credentials right at the start during the prologue. Tonio tells us that it will depict a glimpse of life, uno squarcio di vita, which is putting it pretty straightforwardly. It does so in a dramatic structure that, as we heard, includes the familiar device of a play within a play, but uses this quite brilliantly, reality creeping sort of inexorably into the play to set up the shocking denouement. Leoncavallo claimed that the plot was based on real events from his childhood. However, though his father was a judge, the composer himself was a notoriously unreliable witness. He claimed the idea came from a murder committed by one of his family's servants in 1865, but at best that's only half true. The first performance was given at Milan's Teatro del Verme on the 21st of May, 1892, almost exactly 2 years after Cavalleria. It was conducted by the young Toscanini, and the role of Tonio was taken by Victor Morel, who had created Iago in Verdi's Otello. But unlike Cavalleria, the press reception was cool. Critics were impressed by the skill of Leoncavallo's technique, but less so by his references to earlier operatic styles, which critics felt were there just to please the crowd. It certainly worked. With the Italian public, Pagliacci was an immediate success, much to Mascagni's irritation, of course. I need to very quickly bring one other composer into the story, by far the most successful Italian musician of his generation. During the summer of 1892, Giacomo Puccini was working on Manon Lescaut, and he asked Leoncavallo, who had already helped him on earlier occasions, to write some lines of text for the opera, at least one of which made it into the Act II love duet. The two composers had a warm friendship at the time, but this was soon to end. One day, in March 1893, at a meeting in Milan's Galleria, they were talking about current projects and were shocked, to put it mildly, to discover that each was planning an opera based on the same story. This is, of course, Murger's Scenes of Bohemian Life, La Bohème. Puccini's Bohème began its triumphant conquest of the world's opera houses in 1896, and Leoncavallo's opera, with exactly the same name, had its premiere the following year. Though Puccini admired Leoncavallo's libretto very much, he was greatly relieved to discover that the score didn't live up to the promise of the text. After the first performance of Leoncavallo's Bohème, Puccini wrote a wickedly funny poem which he sent to his sister. Roughly translated, Leon was trumpeted, Cavallo was sounded, but there's only one Bohème. Unsurprisingly, and despite some lovely moments in Leoncavallo's score, history seems to be with Puccini on this one. What of our famous operatic twins? Cav and Pag were finally performed on the same bill at the Metropolitan Opera in New York on the 22nd of December 1893. In fact, it was Pag and Cav on that occasion, with Nellie Melba as Nedda, Fernando de Lucia as Canio in Pagliacci, followed by Emma Calve as Santuzza and the Catalan tenor Francesco Viñas as Turiddu. From then on, the two operas have been more or less inseparable. Anyone who loves to trawl through operatic statistics can spend an entertaining afternoon looking for the occasions when they were given with other operas. Perhaps the most intriguing, at least the marketing device, was the world premiere of Granados' opera Goyescas at the Met in 1916, when it was paired with Pagliacci. Won't have been difficult to sell the new opera to the Met audience, with the prospect of Caruso singing Canio in the second half. The careers of Mascagni and Leoncavallo post-Cav and Pag were certainly successful, but neither of them could sustain achievements to compare with Puccini, whose Il Tabarro is one of the greatest later examples of the purest, most vicious and sordid Italian verismo. Fantastic work. Neither Mascagni nor Leoncavallo attempted to write new operas in the style of their startling early successes, but the influence of these and other verismo operas, including La Bohème, reached beyond Italy's borders. Gustave Charpentier's Louise, subtitled A Musical Novel, by the way, was first performed in Paris, the city that inspired it, in 1900. I've already mentioned Jennifer, and there's also Eugen d'Albert's Tiefland for a bit of German verismo. So much for the verismo diaspora. What of the man who started it all? 20 years after writing Cavalleria rusticana, a journalist asked Mascagni in 1910 if he was now espousing full-blown romanticism. Mascagni replied, absolutely, and imagine, I began with verismo, but verismo kills music. It is in poetry, in romanticism, that inspiration finds its wings. But when he was composing Cavalleria in a desperate hurry, Mascagni surely demonstrated beyond a doubt that verismo could indeed inspire rather than inhibit music. And by the time he died in 1945, Cavalleria had clocked up over 14,000 performances in Italy alone, never mind abroad, testimony to its extraordinary power still to excite and move us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Nigel for those fascinating